Hey there, welcome. Thank you for being here. A lot of my previous articles and videos and things to the like, I've talked about what I believe to be the sort of fundamental training principles behind writing a good training program, particularly for those interested in pursuing strength and endurance simultaneously. But I have yet to make anything that is more specific and shows application of these principles. Neither have I really seen many people do it in a very, detail oriented and truly specific way. So in this video, I wrote up a sample training week. I wouldn't call it a training program because there's a lot of details missing that would constitute a true training program. But I wrote up a training week to show you what a good structure would look like for this type of goal. And as this sort of header here explains, I chose an upper body, lower body split for the lifting specifically, largely because in terms of the sort of questions I get and the inquiries I get about this sort of stuff, upper body, lower body splits tend to predominate. So I figured that'd be a good place to start. If you like what I have to say in this video and you want to see different versions of this with different number of training days, different orientations of training, whatever the case may be, let me know and I can do my best to get to work on that. But I just chose this because there seems to be the most demand, and so I figured that'd be a good place to start. So briefly, the overall plan for this video is to go over the overall structure of the week and talk about it from a bird's eye view. We'll then talk about load management a little bit because, as I've said before, as I view it, load management is really the key to any good training program, no matter what your goals are. So in that sense, I thought it was worth bringing up, especially because it's going to guide a lot of the decisions that are made in this training week. Then we'll go through each individual session and I'll talk about, why I did the things that I did. Finally, there will be a free PDF at the bottom with everything written out more clearly, largely because there's a few different versions of the training weeks that I've written up to try to give you a bit more value in less time and so show you different applications of this sort of training structure. The result of me doing that in the context of this video might make it come off a bit more messy, but if you want to see it all cleanly, I'll write up that PDF and let you download that for free so that everything's a bit more clear. So in terms of the overall structure of what this training week is going to look like, I just had the session start on a Monday. That's typically how my brain works. It doesn't need to start on a Monday. You don't have to do lower body on a Monday, but I just wanted to pick some day of the week so that you can see it across the week. Monday and Thursday will both be lower body strength, mostly strength days. There are going to be two versions of each. Similarly, there's going to be two versions of the Saturday endurance session. And like I said, this is my attempt to show you different applications and provide you with more value in less time. So the option 1 for the lower body 1, 2, and the endurance session on Saturday should be chosen if you are someone who is more interested in biasing endurance a little bit compared to strength, at least for the lower body. If you're interested in biasing strength training a bit more than endurance training, like let's say a 60-40% split focus, then option 2 for each of these sessions, lower body 1, lower body 2, and the Saturday session should be chosen. Tuesday and Thursday will be upper body strength training days. There's only going to be one option. That's a bit more straightforward, I would say. Wednesday is going to be a moderate distance run. And one of the key details I should say that is going to be left out throughout this video is volume. And really, because I don't know what volume of any of this stuff is going to be most appropriate. I'll speak to my thoughts as best I can in regard to volume, but that's one of those details that really is personal to the individual, and there's no number I can give you that's going to work for a good percent of the people watching this video. So we're just going to call this moderate distance, and I'll explain what I mean by moderate distance as we get there. Sunday is going to be a low intensity cross training. I'll explain what I mean by that in just a second. And then again, Saturday is going to be an endurance session, either high intensity intervals or a long run. So it goes without saying that the overall goals a person has should dictate almost everything that is done within a training program. So in order for me to get started in any way, shape, or form in running this training week, I had to pick some combination of goals. I wanted to pick 2 goals that I thought would apply to the greatest number of people who watch this video. So I chose general hypertrophy and running. So general hypertrophy means muscle building, broadly speaking, not like powerlifting, not like any bias anywhere, but just general muscle building, and running because running is the most accessible form of endurance training and typically constitutes the highest tension as far as endurance training goes. So load management, like I said, I wanted to cover this in a bit of detail because it's going to dictate a lot of the decisions that are made in this training week. Load management is really just this idea of applying the appropriate load to the system in order to elicit the desired fitness adaptation, meaning not too little or not too much, and ideally taking into account things like stress and load from life, like poor sleep, stress from work, whatever the case may be. All that stuff obviously is very personal and specific to the individual, so I'm only going to talk about load management in the context of the training program. Largely speaking, it's just the idea that different kinds of training sessions are going to impose different kinds of load and require different demands in terms of recovery. And understanding what these kinds of load and recovery demands and fatigue and timelines look like can really help you be effective and determining what your week's going to look like in terms of training. So to make this more practical, these are a set of guidelines I use, and I want to make a note that I italicized starting point. Most of the clients that I coach stray from these a little bit, but this is typically where I start. There is a specific research paper I base these numbers on that I'll link down below if you are interested. But this is typically where I start. There might be some sort of recovery period that is more appropriate for you, whether that's more or less. But this is where I'd start and see how you feel, and then things can be modified as you go on. So high intensity running, that's max effort running. And again, running I'm using because the goals of this training week is running specifically, but you could include high intensity conditioning really of any kind. Running is going to be the most fatiguing of really any form of endurance training, but nevertheless, this includes any form of max intensity running. It could be intervals, it could be steady state, it could be multiple sets of 2 minutes at max effort. In an ideal world, you should give your legs about 72 hours before they are used intensely or for a prolonged period of time again. Being used intensely could mean high intensity conditioning running, just as I described here, or it could mean strength training. A prolonged period of time, it really means something like a long run, something that's going to be done at a low intensity, but is going to deplete your fuel stores, for lack of a better word. What constitutes a long run is the definition of that is a whole other rabbit hole, which can be saved for another video, but that's a good enough definition for right now, at least. So strength training, if you're strength training your legs, for example, and I put legs here because, typically combining legs with running is one of those main conflicting points people run into with how to do this. But if you're strength training your legs, this is true for upper body also. Ideally, 48 hours is given in terms of rest before they are used intensely or for a prolonged period of time again. This does have a good dependency on volume. So the more volume you do, the more rest you may need. The less volume, the less rest you're going to need. If I was going to give you a good general rule of thumb, 48 hours is what I would say. So long running. Long running is a pretty common practice in any run type of program. The best definition as far as I see it for what a long run is if your carbohydrate stores are near depleted toward the end of it. The recovery from this type of training is going to be mainly dependent upon your ability to refuel after doing this kind of training. So that's why there's a bit less of a recovery demand typically required from that. And then finally, short to moderate distance running can be programmed pretty liberally. This is not going to have a high demand of recovery. It's not going to be too fatiguing. You could do a short to moderate distance run today at an easy intensity and strength train just fine tomorrow and vice versa. Again, there's a specific reference I draw these from. These may vary person to person, but this is typically where I would start with all these different types of training sessions. So what I'll do is I'll run through the option 1 for lower body 1, lower body 2, and the Saturday endurance training. I'll talk about why you might choose this set of options. Then I'll do the same thing for option 2, and then I'll go through everything else. So broadly speaking, I would choose option 1 for all of these options if you want to bias endurance a little bit. I do believe I said that already, but I just wanted to reiterate that. So if you are wanting to take a 60-40 endurance bias, this is how the first session of the week would look in regard to this specific training template. And by the way, you could take this training template, this training week exactly as is and run with it. Or you can, as I go through this, use these thought processes to better hone in your own training. Either one works, but just wanted to put that out there. So plyos, really the thought process behind plyometric training is that it's going to make you a bit bouncier, improve your running economy, which running economy is just the amount of energy you spend with each step you take. So a person with a better running economy, if they burn 500 calories in a run, is going to go farther than the person with a lower running economy. And, which plyometric exercise you choose is really dependent on the person. Some examples as outlined here could be pogos, where your knee is mostly straight and you bounce up and down using only your ankles. Could be high intensity, high knees, depth jumps. In any case, how I would start this session is with a plyometric. That would be followed by a brief bout of high intensity running. And for this specific training week, I'm saying less than 10 minutes of total work time. So that could be 10 minutes at a steady state at a near max effort pace. It could mean intervals where you're going 2 minutes at a 5 out of 10 effort, 1 minute at a 9 to 10 out of 10 effort, repeat that 3 times. Or it could be 2 to 3 sets of all-out bouts of 2 to 3 minutes of running with rest in between each set, the same way you would approach strength training. The idea here is to stimulate and train your higher intensity energy systems to a sufficient degree without disallowing you from training legs elsewhere on this day. For instance, if you did a full 20 to 25-ish minute true high intensity interval training session of running, you likely wouldn't have the energy to do anything else for your legs afterwards. So for the sake of getting everything good enough on this day, that is why I say ideally less than 10 minutes, let's say. Everything else after that is really accessory, I would say. I wouldn't program a true main lift that is a higher priority in terms of strength after high intensity running in this way. But as far as your accessories goes, you can do them somewhat fatigued and still get most of the benefit you might seek to get out of them. The accessories I chose here, I'll speak to why I chose them because I think without any further context, these are a pretty good pick. So single leg hip thrust, this is obviously going to target the glutes, but in a single leg way. Given that it trains the glutes in a much more shortened position, it's unlikely to have a lot of recovery demand afterward. And in my experience coaching people who train hip thrust tend to just feel better when they squat and deadlift. So I like having some kind of hip thrust variation in the program if I can, if it makes sense. Leg extensions and leg curls for each of these movements. So leg extensions obviously train your quads, leg curls obviously train your hamstrings. Each of these is made up of about 4 muscles total. Some people will say 3 for leg curls or for hamstrings rather, but that's a different discussion. One muscle out of the 4 for both the quads and the hamstrings is not active during squat patterns or deadlift patterns. So if all you had to train your quads and your hamstrings with were squats and deadlifts, then there'd be one muscle, the rectus femoris for the leg extensions and the short heads of the biceps femoris for the leg curls or for the hamstrings, that would go relatively untrained. Furthermore, in regard to quadriceps strains that occur in athletics, the most common muscle of the quadriceps that is strained is the rectus femoris, largely because it needs some sort of isolated knee extension for it to be activated at all. I have another video explaining that idea for both the quads and hamstrings in a bit more detail elsewhere, but nevertheless, that is why I pretty much always program some type of isolated knee extension as well as isolated knee flexion, i.e. leg extension, leg curls. Hip abduction and hip adduction are going to target the muscles on the outside and inside of your thighs, respectively. Now, there are hip abductors that are trained and hip adductors that are trained during squats and deadlifts and things of the like, but not all of them are. And so having some isolated targeting of this movement can generally just make your legs and your hips feel better. So that concludes lower body 1, option 1. This is the second lower body of the week, and this is the first option for this slot as well. And in this session, this is where the main lifts as far as strength goes are where I place them, as well as a number of other multi-joint exercises that are pertinent to the legs. So back squats and Romanian deadlifts, these kind of speak for themselves. Reverse lunges again get you on a single leg and should supplement the back squat, as well as the RDLs to a good degree. 45-degree extensions, I like these a lot because essentially they are the same thing as a Romanian deadlift, except the point in the range of motion in which you experience the most tension is going to be a bit different. So I find they make a good supplement to something like an RDL. Kettlebell hip flexor holds. Now this is a movement I program quite often for clients, and I don't really have a better name for it, but this is basically where you would take a kettlebell and put your toes into the handle. You would then lift your knee till it's about level with your hip and then hold that kettlebell there. So the kettlebell wants to drag both your toes down at the level of the ankle as well as your knee down and your at the level of the hip. So this is going to train both your hip flexors and the muscles that bring your toes up, your dorsiflexors. These are groups of muscles that are often neglected. I don't think they need to be trained to the same degree as things like your hamstrings, quads, glutes, calves, etc. But having some form of direct training, optimal or suboptimal it may be, is likely to make your hips and everything else just feel better, and ankles too. And then calf raises, I typically would prefer people to do straight leg calf raises for all their calf raises. I have a video comparing straight leg versus seated calf raises in a bit more detail and why I say that, but nevertheless, I'll just say this. So in regard to the action that a calf raise is, there's really 2 main muscles that are worthy of note, your gastrocnemius and your soleus. Seated calf raises only train your soleus. Standing calf raises or straight leg calf raises, that kind of calf raise in which your knee is straight, will train your soleus just as much as a seated calf raise, but will also train your gastrocnemius. So the only difference is that the gastrocnemius is left untrained in a seated calf raise. So you might as well train standing calf raises or straight leg calf raises. So to capitulate the option 1 of this overall training week, if you want to bias endurance a little bit, then Saturday I would program as a long run. I like to program long runs on weekends because people typically have more time to do so on the weekend. And again, a long run is, as I see it, best defined as your carbohydrate stores being near depleted towards the end of it. So in endurance sports, this is often known as hitting the wall because you reach this point where it just feels like there's not enough gas in the tank left to move your legs at all. And broadly speaking, in regard to using carbs or fats for fuel during exercise, if you were to compare 2 people, one of which was highly aerobically trained the other was highly untrained, and you had them run, let's say, 3 miles for max effort. The untrained person would use almost exclusively carbohydrates for fuel, while the trained person would use some kind of mix, let's say 50-50, just for example's sake, of fats and carbohydrates for fuel. When your carbohydrate stores run out, per se, carbs are mostly stored in the muscle, by the way. When they run out, then you experience a sense of true physical fatigue, or at least that's when true physical fatigue will start to set in. So if you are better at using fat for fuel earlier on and for longer in exercise, your carb stores, however many carbs are stored, will last longer, and therefore fatigue will be pushed off farther. So that's why one of the main adaptations that occurs when you perform cardiovascular training is an increased ability to use fats for fuel during exercise and probably at rest too. Nevertheless, the state of your carbohydrate stores being near depleted can serve as a potent stimulus for aerobic adaptation, and that's why you see so many, endurance training programs incorporate some type of long day, because that's kind of the goal there. So now I'm going to go through option 2 for all of those different sessions, because I think if I go through it in this way, it's going to make the most sense. Again, I'll write everything up a bit more cleanly in a PDF at the bottom in the description box of this video so that you can see how things would work together in a bit more of a neat way. So these option 2s, it's going to be a bit quicker here, are going to have a lot of the same movements as option 1 and option 2, but the volume of the strength training is going to be likely a little bit higher, and there's not going to be any type of endurance training on the lower body 1 or lower body 2 day. So lower body 1, this would be barbell back squats, seated leg curls, machine abductions, kettlebell hip flexor holds, and standing calf raises. And again, sort of broad thought process here. Barbell back squats are going to train your quads, your glutes. They're going to miss one of the quadriceps of the 4 muscles that make up the quadriceps. They're going to train your adductors to some degree, mostly your adductor magnus, and the other ones to some small degree. Seated leg curls will train all the muscles of your hamstrings. None of the hamstrings will be left out in that movement. Machine hip abductions will train the hip abductors. So abduction, by the way, is just bringing your leg out to the side. And the muscles that perform this, your hip abductors, are on the outside of your hip, like your glute medius, glute minimus, things like that. And then kettlebell hip flexor holds and standing calf raises I already spoke to in a little bit of detail in option 1. So this is option 2 for the second lower body day of the week. Many deadlifts, this is going to train 3 of your 4 hamstrings. And again, dumbbell or barbell, either one, I don't have a preference there. It'll also train your glutes, your lower back, and to some degree your adductors, similar to the barbell back squats. Leg extensions will train all 4 muscles of your quadriceps, so it fills in the hole left by these squats in the first session of this week. Machine hip abductions are going to train all those machine or hip abductors on the inside of your thighs that are left out or not trained sufficiently in things like deadlifts or squats. And then again, these are already spoken for. So if you are choosing option 2 and you want to bias strength training in this overall routine, then I would recommend that the Saturday endurance session is a high intensity interval run. And as I note here, real high intensity interval training and not some just bullshit weight training circuit type thing. Now, in the research, high intensity interval training doesn't really have a super hard definition, but one thing that most people will agree on is that the intervals that are the hard intervals should be near or true max effort. They shouldn't be moderate effort by any stretch of the imagination. That kind of defeats the point of this kind of training. So 2 ways I can go about this, and I'll explain why I would choose one or the other. So one of which, and these are very common frameworks I use with clients. So you could do 2 minutes at a RPE is rate of perceived exertion. So basically how hard you are rating in exercise on a scale from 1 to 10. So 2 minutes at a 4 to 5 out of 10 effort, 2 minutes at an 8 to 10 out of 10 effort. You repeat that with no rest in between for 3 to 5 times. If this is done right, you should have no energy left to continue by the end of this training session. If these intervals are true max intensity, you should feel cooked by the end of this. Another framework that I'll commonly use with clients is 2 minutes at that 4 to 5 out of 10 effort, RPE 4 to 5, 4 minutes at RPE 8 to 10, and then that repeated only 3 times because it is already increased training time just by way of a longer hard interval. The difference between these 2 forms of intervals is that this first one is going to target your glycolytic system a bit more in detail, and this one is going to target your aerobic system in a bit more detail. So why you would choose one or the other really depends on the person. If you don't know which one you need more than the other, you could just pick one for a month, pick the other for a month, go back and forth in that way. And that concludes the Saturday session and really the both options of what this training week would look like. So let's talk a bit about the upper body training. So this session I would describe as the volume being a bit more spread out across the various parts of the upper body that you can train, whereas the second upper body day of this week It's going to be a bit more specific into chest and back, really, I would say. So in regard to chest training, I typically like to see some type of press from multiple different angles, flat probably being the most important of the three, if you define the three angles in which you can bench or, chest press as an incline, flat, and decline. Flats, if you had to pick one, probably going to give you your best bang for your buck, and that's why that lift is prioritized across the week. Barbell rows, this exercise here, let me actually take a step back actually in regard to back training. So typically one way you can think about back training that's going to cover most of your bases is some type of wide horizontal row, some type of narrow horizontal row, some type of wide pull down, and some type of narrow pull down. There's a lot of different muscles within the back that you can look to train, but if you just think through those 4 different kinds of movements, that's usually going to cover all your bases right there. So barbell rows, by way of the barbell being fixed, is going to force you to row a bit wider. And then neutral grip or pull-ups or pull-downs will force you to have that narrow orientation vertical pull. For the triceps, which head is mostly affected by where your elbow is in space, whether your elbow is overhead, whether your elbow is even with your shoulder, or whether your elbow is down. Here, your elbow is going to be down, obviously down by your side. In the upper body 2 of this week, there is going to be a different tricep exercise with your elbow at a different orientation to sort of train that from a different angle. And then as far as the muscles that flex your elbow, so bring your hand closer to your shoulder, there's really 3 of note. There's your biceps, which is the obvious one. There's your brachialis, which sits right underneath your biceps. And then there is your brachioradialis. Your biceps is responsible for bending your elbow when your palm is faced towards the sky. Your brachialis is responsible for bending your elbow when your palm is faced towards the ground. So think like a reverse curl or something like that. And then your brachioradialis is the primary bender of your elbow when your palm is about neutral. So this would be brachioradialis. This is biceps. This is brachialis. Typically, your brachioradialis is going to get enough stimulation from things like pull-ups, pull-downs, rows, because that's the orientation your hand is going to be in when you do those sorts of exercises. So I typically will only program, palm up, palm down curls to target the other elbow flexors, unless a person really wants to train that aspect of their arm. But I just bring that up to sort of compare and contrast why a dumbbell curl incline with palm up, which isn't here, versus the type of curl that will be used later on in the week. So moving on to your second upper body day of the week. So supported rows, talk about back first. This is an exercise, I typically just call them supported rows, but your chest is on an incline bench and you're rowing and pulling the dumbbells up in that way. By way of them being dumbbells, you will more than likely pull with your elbows close to your body. So that covers the sort of narrow horizontal pull. And then wide grip pull-ups or pull-downs, just by way of them being wide grip, will cover that wide vertical pull. And again, that sort of wide and narrow horizontal and vertical pulls will cover pretty much all the muscles in your back that you might want to cover. Incline dumbbell bench press and push-ups were selected to sort of supplement the flat barbell bench press earlier in this week and to train the chest from a bit of a different angle. And then as far as shoulder and arm training goes, we used shoulder presses earlier in the week, and that's going to train your shoulders from a bit more of a global perspective, where side raises are going to train just your medial deltoid, whereas your shoulders are made up of a front, lateral, middle, and back rear deltoid, or rear head. Any kind of pressing movement is going to sufficiently train the front deltoid. Most types of pulling, so any type of back training, is usually going to sufficiently train the posterior or the rear deltoid. The side deltoid, the medial, lateral, whatever you want to call it, the one that's most in the middle, is not really stimulated greatly during any other form of pushing or pulling, apart from your shoulder press kind of movement. So adding a side raise in can help to sort of complete that. Skull crushers, now this is where you're lying flat on a bench. Usually your elbows are directly over your shoulders and you're only moving around the elbow. Again, your triceps are trained a bit differently depending on where your elbow is in space. So this is going to target that in a bit of a different way. And as far as pronated curls, so whenever your palm is faced towards the ground, that is when it's in a pronated position. And if you were to curl with your hand in that position, then you were to train the brachialis as opposed to the biceps more so. It's more of a bias, but an example of an exercise there would be a reverse curl where you grab the easy bar, the zigzag bar, with your palm face towards the floor, and you do curls with that way. And typically what you'll find with this type of exercise is that the sensation in your arm when you're doing this type of pronated curl will feel a bit deeper than what the biceps is. And that's because the brachialis lies underneath the biceps. So Wednesday is a moderate distance run. Really, the purpose behind a moderate distance run is that it's not going to really fatigue you too much or have too much of a recovery demand, but it is going to give you a good addition of total weekly volume to your running in the week. And briefly, when you're talking about volume for endurance training, typically your total weekly volume across the entire week is the number that is most important, as opposed to your volume in any individual session. And a sort of moderate distance run is a pretty good way to add a good number to that without really adding any fatigue or compromising next day training, by any stretch of the imagination. As I say here, what moderate means depends entirely on what your fitness level is at the moment. For example's sake, let's imagine a person who a run where if they did it at a slow pace, but if they did all the distance would be fatiguing, for quite some time, maybe make you want to nap afterward, is 10 miles. In this case, a moderate distance run would be somewhere between 4 to 6 miles or so, let's say. Another sort of guideline you can use to dictate what moderate distance run is somewhere between 30 to 60 minutes, because if you're training for between 30 to 60 minutes and you're at a true easy to moderate intensity, at that sort of dose, whatever the pace is and whatever that means for you is probably not going to be too fatiguing to compromise any training later on. And then finally, on Sunday, I would program some type of cross training. Now, the cross training, as I define it here, is the use of an alternate mode of endurance training to supplement the primary goal. So for running specifically, an example would be using something like cycling to supplement your running. The reason being is that cycling is much less fatiguing than running is, but still will train your aerobic system and your cardiovascular system to a good degree without the sort of fatigue that comes with the impact of running. And this is a strategy I use all the time with clients because I think it has a lot of value, because in general, at least in my experience, the sort of tissue tolerance that's required to progress running over time does not seem to progress as fast as the aerobic cardiovascular adaptations. And so if you, let's say it doesn't make much more sense to add miles of running, but you want to train aerobically more and push that a bit more, then you could probably hop on a bike and it'd be no big deal. Now, what would constitute the best type of exercise to use as cross training is really going to depend on where the deficiency most notably lies. My personal preference is usually something like an Airdyne or a bike, but swimming, rowing, ski erg, those aren't bad options either. I gave a heart rate prescription there, but really heart rate is very dependent on the exercise being at hand. For instance, what constitutes an easy intensity on running and cycling is going to translate to two very different heart rates. The reason being is that in running, your upper body is working as a counterweight to your lower body. So your heart has to pump blood, a good amount of it there also. Whereas in cycling, really only your legs are being used. So your heart only has to pump blood there. So it doesn't need to pump as much. So your heart rate will be lower on cycling. So it's hard to give you a real heart rate target, but broadly speaking, this should feel easy. It shouldn't feel like something, even I would keep this below moderate intensity to do this right. And again, as far as duration goes, because this is really only going to be done to an easy intensity, and it's usually going to be done with an exercise that is not too fatiguing, you could go up to 90 minutes if you are highly trained, or it could just be 30 minutes and that would still be very meaningful and help you out a lot if you are not someone who's really, up to par with 90 minutes. And this certainly turned out to be a bit of a longer video, but that is all of the slides that I have for you here today. I hope you found that somewhat interesting or helpful or somewhere in between. Again, I'm going to put a cleaner PDF down below if you want to see everything in a bit more of a neat fashion. If you have any sort of comments, questions, concerns, anything like that, link them down below, or don't link them, just comment that. I don't know why I said link. And I will see you next time. Thanks for being here.